I'm Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard. I'm joined today by a very special guest, Tony Abbott. He is the former Prime Minister of Australia. He served as the leader of the opposition from 2009 to 2013, and as Prime Minister from 2013 to 2015 as the leader of the Liberal Party. Welcome, Mr. Abbott.
And Derek,
I know what you're going to say. You're going to clarify what Liberal means.
Yes, in Australia, the Liberal Party is a conservative party broadly. Certainly, we are the most conservative mainstream political party in Australia.
Well, I guess the Nationals.
Well, the Nationals and the Liberals are traditionally in coalition.
Yeah.
And I used to say that a National is a country Liberal and a Liberal is a city National. So there's a difference in culture between the Liberal Party and the National Party, but there's not normally a sharp difference in politics. And the Liberal National Coalition in Australia is the equivalent of the Conservative Party here in Canada.
Yeah.
And if I may say so for the benefit of your listeners who aren't familiar with Australian politics, my government did two unique things. First, we stopped a wave of illegal migration by boat. We're the only Western government in recent times to have done that. And second, we repealed a carbon tax. And that's pretty rare as well.
You did it before. It was cool.
A government that genuinely repeals a carbon tax, doesn't just pretend to repeal a carbon tax while leaving the worst carbon tax in place.
We had to get to that right in the start, because any conversation I've ever had with an Australian about politics immediately begins with explaining that the Liberals are not Liberals as we would see it. I think maybe a holdover from when the Liberal parties coming from the British Commonwealth were classical Liberal parties, which they're now social democratic parties.
Well, we had much the same development in Australia in the late 19th century. You had New South Wales liberalism, which tended to be free trade liberalism, and you had Victorian liberalism, which tended to be big government liberalism. And of course, in Australia, liberalism has developed more in a free market way, whereas in North America, liberalism has developed very much into a big government movement. Look, I suppose if you go back to the roots of liberalism, it's about human flourishing, and some of us think that humans flourish best when most free. Others think that humans flourish best when most helped, typically by government. And I guess, this is one of those arguments which waxes and wanes, and it develops differently in different places. But it is, I guess, one of those things that we humans will never get beyond. Our disputes on issues like this, where often enough there's something to be said for either side.
I suppose I would probably understand the political nomenclature a bit more than most people from Canada, because I know a few hardline libertarians here who still call themselves liberals, and they're like, I'm not giving up the term. I think it's a pretty dying battle in North America, but I get it. Also, I actually used to play footy.
Rugby union?
No. Footy, Australian rules football.
Aussie rules
in Canada.
footy.
I played in the Ontario League and very briefly in the Alberta League.
Wow. I never knew that Aussie rules was played.
It's not very big. It's not very big, but
I might have been a champion Aussie rules player if I came to Canada.
Oh, you would have been. The Australian,
because I was a hopeless Aussie rules player in Australia.
There were guys who were, just all the Australians were always stars on the team, and they, over a couple of years, they admit they were not very good there. I've probably played half a dozen hockey games, not even that in my life. But if I went to Australia, I'm sure I'd be
a superstar.
Just because I theoretically know how to skate.
If you could find an ice hockey rig in Australia, you'd do bloody well.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to talk about your political career, and how there might be parallels or lessons for what's happening and what has just taken place in Canada. You served as the leader of the opposition from 2009 to 2013. You formed government in 2013. I think you're aware, Pierre Poilievre has been the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada here. And he was a very different kind of leader than we've had for some time. He was certainly more bellicose and populist than, say, Stephen Harper was. Probably had a more finely honed conservative platform than, say, Andrew Scheer, and certainly a hell of a lot more conservative than we had with Aaron O'Toole, the previous conservative leader. He was widely expected to win a mega sweeping supermajority government until the Liberals swapped out Trudeau with Carney, and then to the surprise of pretty much everybody, the Liberals came within a hair of winning majority. Poilievre did not even win his own seat. He's now running the by-election here in Alberta in a very safe conservative seat. Do you see any parallels between your time in opposition and Pierre Poilievre? And and if so, what was maybe the inflection point where your careers diverged, where you failed to win the election, but you did win it 2013?
Well, it's far too soon to write Pierre off, because he's going to come back into the parliament, we hope, and almost certainly will be the leader of the opposition. And while, yes, the election result was a dreadful disappointment for the Conservatives, the Liberals certainly didn't have a smashing win either. They just scraped back. Look, the fundamental point to make is that no election is unlosable, no election is unwinnable. Every election turns very much on the circumstances of the time, and two significant circumstances changed between late last year, when the Conservatives were 20 points up in the polls, and the actual election date. First of all, the Liberals swapped out unpopular Trudeau for a kind of fresh face, at least in a local context. And second, Donald Trump took office in the United States and immediately waged what looked like a tariff war against Canada.
New Zealand was not threatening to annex Australia.
No, Australia was not threatening to annex New Zealand. So, look, when people feel that their country is under serious threat, they tend to rally around the flag, and they tend to rally behind the government of the day. So I think Carney benefited on two counts. First, he was a fresh face and people wanted to give him a chance, a fair go. And second, he looked like he was standing up for Canada against the bully in Washington. So I think that largely explains the loss of the election. Nevertheless, I've got to say that as an Anglosphere conservative, it disappoints me greatly that there is not a strong, tough-minded conservative government here in Canada. And I think that's what Pierre would have led, a tough-minded conservative government that made big changes to the energy madness, wanted Canada to take advantage of its natural advantages in fossil fuel, didn't want to impose unnecessary costs on people through all of these various carbon taxes and other measures. And I think he also would have been a very proud Canadian who didn't allow the constant dilution, if you like, of core Canada, which is almost inevitable when you've got sustained record immigration. And I think on these two critical topics, Pierre would have run a very different and very much better government than we're likely to get under Mark Carney.
So I want to come to immigration, but first I want to touch on carbon tax. You've already mentioned it here. You repealed your carbon tax sometime between 2013 2015, while you're prime minister. At that time, carbon tax hadn't even yet become so-called popular in Canada. We had one in British Columbia, and it was, at least for some time, actually revenue neutral. But they never stayed revenue neutral. It became a revenue collector. And then we had the imposition of Alberta carbon tax, and then a federal carbon tax on top. Trudeau came to power in 2015, not campaigning on a carbon tax, but he just ended up doing one anyway. And then people accepted it. Canadians are often like that. They'll accept a policy imposed without a mandate, because once it's there and the sky doesn't fall, they just go with it. And it built such a consensus in the media and the Laurentian expert classes that by the 2021 election federally, even the Conservative Party of Canada under Aaron O'Toole was running on a carbon tax itself, one that was actually even worse and more interventionist than the Liberal one. Between 2021 and now, the consensus radically changed to the point where Mark Carney repealed at least the consumer portion of the federal carbon tax. The industrial portion is still there, and it very well could get worse. But you repealed it at a time when globally these were very much in vogue at all the major international conferences. This is touted as the cure-all. How did you? Also, in Australia is not known as a major fossil fuel producer.
We are. We're the world's biggest coal exporter. And until recently, we were the world's biggest maybe exporter as well. We rivaled Qatar.
Okay, well, maybe you are. I just not known for it. At least, shame on me again for maybe not knowing it. But but it plays less of a role as a proportion of its economy than in Alberta, certainly.
Our three biggest exports are iron ore, coal, and gas. So fossil fuels, one way or another, are incredibly important to Australia.
Not lamb? I can't buy lamb. It's not from you or not for New Zealand.
Our agricultural exports are, I think, if you add up all of our different agricultural exports, our beef, our sheep, our wheat, our wine, that all of them together would not be more than maybe a third or a half of our coal exports in value.
Okay. So, but you took on the carbon tax just as it was becoming very popular globally, particularly in the West, where you're really the only places that oppose these things. How did you build a coalition against it when you're really swimming against the tide, before the kind of global tide had turned against these things? Global warming, climate change hysteria is reaching its peak. That's a difficult time to take on that issue. Was there a political cost to be paid for it, or was it a political winner?
Well, Derek, if climate change is approached as a moral issue, the left wins. If climate change is approached as an economic issue, the right wins. And what I said to people was, look, of course we have got to respect the planet. We only have one. And yes, I accept that climate does change, that mankind does make a difference, and that we should do what we can to reduce emissions. But I would always add this critical rider, but not if it costs you your job, costs us our industries, and puts up your cost of living. So I said that, sure, let's do what we can to reduce emissions, but let's not do it by whacking a great big tax on everything, which is what an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax is. It's a great big tax on everything. And when I finally abolished the carbon tax about 9 months into my government, it was the one and only time in the last 2 decades that there was a substantial fall in electricity prices. They fell by well over 10% in a quarter because the carbon tax was making such a difference. So what you've got to do to win this argument, because people will often tell you that the so-called science is settled. Now, I don't think that's true.
Anytime you say it's settled, you're very unscientific.
But nevertheless, it's hard to win an argument on so-called climate science, but you can very readily win an argument on the impact of climate policy, if the impact of climate policy is to destroy your job and to put your cost of living through the roof. And every time there has been an election in Australia where the centre-right fought hard on this issue against the centre-left's climate cultism, the centre-right has done well. In 2010, in 2013, and in 2019, we in the Australian Liberal National Coalition fought hard on climate and energy, saying that we are not going to do anything that is going to badly damage our economy. And in all three of those elections, we did much better than expected, and we had a smashing victory in 2013. So look, politics is always about a contest. If you aren't prepared to create a contest on policy, it becomes a beauty contest. And what's the point of being in a beauty contest, particularly when politics is show business for ugly people?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to create a policy contest. And I
Does a company accept it?
And I think the most important immediate policy contest is energy, where this climate-driven mania for renewables is a form of economic self-harm. I'd put it even stronger than that. In countries like Australia, we are on the verge of committing a form of economic suicide by moving rapidly away from reliable 24/7 fossil fuels to intermittent renewable power, because while batteries and solar panels can run a house, they cannot run a modern industrial economy. And yet that's what we're trying to do in Australia, and it's insane.
Well, that's a great segue to where I want to go there's few countries in the world that are as similar as Canada and Australia. Roughly similar geographic size. Vast tracts of our country is, for all intents and purposes, not practically habitable for arable land and whatnot. So we have, thin strips of population and huge tracts of
Wilderness.
Yeah, that's the way we put it politely, I guess, in both countries. We're English-speaking Westminster democracies.
Federations under the crown.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest difference in our political systems is that you have a rational Senate of some kind. And
we have an elected Senate as opposed to a kind of a House of Lords type Senate.
Ours is even worse than the House of Lords because it's not even based on if your parents did something, if your great-grandparents did something of note. Ours is just, did you donate the right amount to the Liberal Party?
And it's a very powerful Senate, unlike the House of Lords in Britain, which can delay, but it can't deny.
Yeah. But overall, but even the shapes of our economies are very similar. Heavy in primary resource extraction and agriculture, export focused. I mean, as an island, you're by necessity export focused, but we're export focused. We've been struggling. Probably one of the defining issues in Canadian politics over at least the last 15 years has been resource extraction versus climate change, hardline environmental protection. And the debate appears to be swinging more back in favor of resource development, wealth creation right now, away from kind of radical green ideology, at least rhetorically. The new federal government here is rhetorically more, at least less implacably anti-resource development, but still far too early to see how it's going to manifest itself. We have actually it's a major Australian project just south of here in the Crow's Nest Pass in the Rocky Mountains. I think it's a metallurgical coal project, and there's the opposition to it is actually not even from the locals. They had a referendum there. It was something like 70% supported it. But then you've got folks in cities who actually don't live anywhere near this kind of thing who are up in arms saying, this is going to destroy everything. As is often the case, it's not actually the locals, it's city dwellers. But, what are some of the Australian lessons in building consensus around? You also have, Indigenous issues that you face similar to us. It's another one of the major parallels, especially as it involves our economy and resource development. What were some of the major challenges you faced that Canada also faces, and perhaps some of the lessons that we can take from the successes you had?
Well, Derek, I think that all of the Anglosphere countries face similar problems today. Depending upon the government of the day, they deal with them differently. But I think all the major Anglosphere countries have the problem of economic stagnation, a problem of social fracturing, and a problem of strategic peril. I think all of us are in a similar boat. And I think that at the heart of the economic stagnation is the politics of climate And I think at the heart of the political the social fracturing is identity politics. So I think we've got to tackle both the politics of climate and identity politics head on as serious centre-right politicians and political movements. And look, as I said earlier, if you approach climate as a moral issue, you're not hiding for nothing, because if the climate really is changing and we really do have to reduce emissions to zero as quickly as possible or die, yes, there's an imperative.
Mm-hmm.
If the climate is changing, I don't think it's changing that fast. And to the extent that it's changing, I think it's far from clear that human beings are the key factor. I mean, one of the challenges I always put to the climate alarmists is, how do you explain the ice ages? Because it was a very different climate then, and obviously human beings had nothing to do with it. I think it's far more likely that the biggest impacts on climate are less atmospheric carbon dioxide than sunspot activity and oscillations in the orbit of the Earth around the sun. I mean, it stands to reason that the biggest impact on the Earth's climate is the sun. So you'd think that changes there would be what matter most. But let's put the so-called science of climate change aside for a second and look at the economics of it. If you try to eliminate fossil fuels, not only do you make your energy far more expensive and far less reliable, but you also imperil just about every aspect of daily life. I mean, look around this room. There's plastic, there's glass, there's steel, there's synthetic cloths. All of these are critically dependent on fossil fuels. I mean, fossil fuels are the feedstock, not just of our power system, but of just about all the things we take for granted in modern life. I mean, these things that are ubiquitous and that every climate activist spends half his life on, these things are impossible without the oil and the gas that goes into making the things that comprise them. So we've got to understand that this emissions fixation is going to cause us to live like the Amish or worse if we take it to its logical conclusion. I think we just have to keep reminding people that energy is the economy, that you cannot have a community without an economy to sustain it. And if we drive fossil fuels out of our economy, we are making modern life almost impossible. I just think we've got to, I mean, I suppose if you're living in the city, you might think that water comes out of a tap as opposed to a dam. You might think that milk comes in a bottle as opposed to out of a cow. Mm-hmm. All this stuff comes out of fossil fuels, and we've just got to understand that.
Okay, well, I want to switch gears to immigration, kind of tangentially touch on it a little bit so far. Wealthy countries are magnets for migration, legal and illegal.
Yeah.
There's been a huge shift in public opinion in Canada pretty recently, where we've generally always been. It's been verboten to even talk about having, even a mid-level of arrivals, but we just essentially abandoned all controls whatsoever, and we had wild numbers of people just pouring in to a saturation point that we simply couldn't absorb it. It's been one of the major contributing factors to the housing crisis, cost of living crisis. We're not just taking the cream of the crop from other countries now. We're scraping the barrel. We're getting people who are not good candidates to become members of Western civilization. But that's a very recent transformation of public opinion in Canada, where anyone who if you even mentioned it in any context other than more, you were called a racist, a xenophobe, bigot. Now even the liberals are backing away from what they've done Yeah, the Conservatives will raise questions about how the Liberals are coming along on their targets, and they'll say, "Well, you're a racist." And, so some of their rhetoric hasn't changed. But you cracked down on a lot of illegal migration, which by necessity has to can't walk across the border into Australia. What kind of political pushback did you get for that? Because that was at a time. Actually, it would have been just at the time when migration consensus in Europe was just changing. Angela Merkel had just bullied her EU partners into throwing open the gates and allowing tons of so-called refugees, many of which were not legitimate refugees, just to pour into Germany and to pour into the rest of Europe, straining social services, straining housing, and obviously creating major, major cultural issues as well. But you were kind of at the tip of the spear there before there had been I don't know, what kind of, were Australians already on that page, or were you kind of going against the grain by cracking down on migration at that time?
Well, what I cracked down on was illegal migration by boat. And the problem with illegal migration by boat is, A, it's illegal, but B, it's also very dangerous because you get a lot of people drowning at sea. So by stopping it, you are actually being a humanitarian. Mm-hmm. We'd had a wave of illegal migration by boat in the late 1990s, which was effectively stopped by the Howard government. There was a change of government in 2007, and the incoming Labor government reversed the Howard government policies, which had stopped the boats, and naturally enough, the boats started up again. And in the 6 years of the Labor government, a trickle of illegal migrant boats ultimately became a flood. And I said in opposition that we would stop the boats. I said we would do it by any and all means in our power, including turning boats around and sending them back to Java, which is where 99% of them were coming from. And the response of the then Labor government was to say, A, it's immoral, B, it's illegal, and C, it would cause tension, perhaps even conflict with Indonesia. And I said, well, I'm sorry, a country which loses control of its borders has ultimately lost control of its sovereignty. It's ultimately subject to a peaceful invasion, and no self-respecting country can put up with that. So when I was elected in 2013, I said that we were implementing these strong border protection policies. At one stage, I was told that we'd had advice that this was against international law, and I said, well, let's get better advice, which we did. Mm-hmm. One lawyer says X, you can normally find another lawyer to say Y, and what we called Operation Sovereign Borders essentially involved stopping these illegal boats on the high seas, and instead of bringing them to Australia, which is what had happened under the previous government, we would send them back to Indonesia. Now, the people smugglers were smart, so they soon worked out that when an Australian naval or customs vessel hove into view, they would scuttle their ships, and our sailors, being decent human beings, would pick them up.
Let them drown, yeah.
Pick them up. Mm. The expectation was we'd then take them to Australia. Well, no, we had a different plan. We put them in a mothership, kept them at sea, and then on a suitably calm night, would put them into unsinkable orange life rafts, take them to within a mile or two of Indonesian territorial waters with just enough fuel to get back to Indonesia. So that's the one. And that's what happened. So look, within maybe 3 or 4 months of coming into office, the illegal boats completely stopped. And from early 2014 until I think 2022, when the government changed, there wasn't a single illegal boat. We've had a few illegal boats since then, not very many, because the new Labor government, to its credit, having been ferociously opposed to our policies when we put them forward and when we implemented them, they reluctantly conceded that actually worked. And while I think there would be some pressure inside the Green left to go back to what are effectively open borders, the more sensible people in the current government know that this would be political suicide. And so any illegal boats that have made it to Australia, the occupants have swiftly been deported, which is the only way to approach this. So look, we sorted illegal migration by boat. What we haven't sorted is mass legal migration.
Yeah,
and
that's where I want to go.
And over the last decade, legal migration has gone up from about 200,000 a year to about 500,000 a year. Even at 200,000 a year, it was far too high. At 500,000 a year, it's just putting massive downward pressure on wages, massive upward pressure on housing costs, severe strain on physical and social infrastructure. And yes, there are also integration issues with some of the people who are coming. And I think what we need to do is first radically scale back the numbers, and second, be much more insistent with all of our migrants that if they're coming to Australia, they've got to join Team Australia. They can't simply live in Hotel Australia. Australia has flourished as a country with a predominantly Anglo-Celtic culture and a country with an overwhelmingly Judeo-Christian ethos. They are both precious. They have to be preserved, and no one should come to Australia without an expectation of living in an Anglo-Celtic culture with a Judeo-Christian ethos, and we've got to be crystal clear about that.
Yeah, I mean, Canada didn't have quite the same issue with illegal migration because the boat. Like, how would you get to Canada by float?
It's a very long journey.
I mean, it's a bit further from
Afghanistan to Canada by boat is a pretty big trip.
Yeah, it's a little further than Java to what's the one?
Christmas Island.
Okay,
Java to Christmas Island is about 200 miles.
Yeah, so it's a bit more of a jump.
Yeah.
So we've had some illegal migration, but it's generally people who are being kicked out of the states because they're illegal migrants there, and then they're they traipse over the border. They just declare refugee status, and our bureaucracy is too overwhelmed to be able to process them. But it's a relatively small number. It's legal migration. It was very high for a long time, even under Stephen Harper, but it was a generally merit-based system. Had a bunch of family reunification stuff, which is problematic because you'd bring over older people who've never paid into the social system, and then they're on the healthcare system.
Yeah,
but it was at least manageable. But then legal migration, like in Australia, has just peaked far beyond any previous records, completely swamped things. Same issues with housing, downward pressure on wages, but also now major cultural conflict we're starting to see because we used to be on a merit-based system. We were attracting at least the upper crust or upper mid-level crust of people in other countries, which isn't very good for those countries when we're sucking all the best away from them to begin with. But we're not getting just the best now, and it's just not very compatible in general. And so it is taken people like me who used to be pretty unabashedly pro reasonable levels of migration, and to the point where I think we need to pretty much seal the border for a decade with, we'll take your top engineers and doctors, we'll take like 5,000 people a year of the absolute cream of the crop. We'll take refugee nuclear scientists from Iran or something, where we've just got to almost stop migration for at least a period of a decade to digest it and catch up.
Well, Derek,
and Australia is facing similar.
You're making very good points. I mean, like Canada, Australia is an immigrant society. And the glory of Australia is that people have been able to come here from all over the world and make a wonderful living for themselves and for their kids. But just at the moment, as I said, it's getting almost completely out of control, mostly because government has effectively subcontracted out immigration to educational institutions that use overseas students as a cash cow, have become part of their business model, at the heart of their business model, and to, I think, slightly unscrupulous businesses that would rather import people from overseas, allegedly on a short-term basis, than pay locals what the locals would expect to do the relevant job, or to train up locals to do the relevant job. So essentially, we've been bringing people in often to do relatively short-term English language courses, to work in menial jobs. Most of them are managing to stay one way or another. I don't blame them for wanting to come to Australia. Who wouldn't? I don't blame them for wanting to make a good life in Australia. Who shouldn't? But at these numbers, it's just not fair to the Australians who are already here, because of the impact on wages, the impact on housing, the impact on infrastructure, and yes, the impact on social cohesion, because at least some of the recent migrant communities have tended to bring their troubles with them, to bring their, if you like, prejudices with them. And I dare say many people in Canada noticed the day of infamy, October the 9th, when you had a large and angry crowd gather outside the Sydney Opera House screaming obscenities against Jewish people and shouting what sounded very much like "Gas the Jews." Now, that was largely recent immigrants to our country. Mm-hmm. I guess you've got an unholy alliance between recent immigrants from Muslim countries and the cultural Marxist left, which sees Israel as a settler colonialist obscenity, and sees Jewish people as manifestations of white privilege, etc. So you've got this ugly alliance, which has produced a real outpouring of anti-Semitism or Jew hatred in our country, which I think is, it's sad, it's despicable, it's un-Australian, and it's been exacerbated by migration.
Yeah, and we've seen it right across the Western world. It is just a bizarre alliance where you've got people who are practically medieval barbarians. By depending on how you're defining the political spectrum, you could put them as the furthest possible right in some kind of way, I guess. Allied with cultural Marxists, but it's a whole other topic.
It's. I mean, what are we going to do here? I mean, we've got to get back to common sense, and a common sense view is that countries like Australia, Canada, Britain, America are the least racist, most colourblind countries on earth. And yes, if you look back into our history, there was the British Empire, there was slavery, there was Indigenous dispossession. And other than slavery, I think there's a lot to be, I mean, let's put slavery to one side, which was a dreadful blot on America. But Indigenous people in Australia, in the long run, are much better off, thanks to British settlement. Yeah, I presume the same as
it's very much the same. Canada. We don't like to admit it, but it's true.
The British Empire, yes, there were exploitative elements. Yes, there was a degree of paternalism, maybe even racism. But in the end, the British Empire has been good for the world. Parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, respect for human rights. All of these things were byproducts.
Well, even slavery. It was the first major power to end slavery.
The Royal Navy,
to declare little war on it.
The Royal Navy spent the best part of a century stamping out the transatlantic slave trade, and thousands of British sailors, untold wealth was consumed in this essentially moral project to stamp out slavery. I mean, much of the British Empire in Africa was a result of the flag-following missionaries who were there specifically to stamp out man's inhumanity of man, of which slavery is the most obvious and gross manifestation. So honestly, we should be so proud of our record, and Britain in particular. No country on earth has had more impact on the modern world for good than Britain. I mean, when you think of the mother of parliaments, the Industrial Revolution, the emancipation of minorities, all the world's common language, all originated in Britain. And yet there's this epidemic of self-doubt, even self-loathing across the Anglosphere right now. And it must end, because in the end, national self-loathing is just as toxic as personal self-loathing. I mean, low self-esteem is personally poisonous, and low national self-esteem is no less civilizational doubt.
I think it goes well beyond the Anglosphere. I think it's Western civilization in general, with a few exceptions. Perhaps Poland, Hungary, sometimes Australia, sometimes America, or portions within them, and perhaps even France. Some of the French are still pretty damn proud of being French. But in general, it's a problem that plagues the Anglosphere, but also I think the West in general.
It does plague the West in general, but it's most acute in the Anglosphere. And this is the paradox. The Anglosphere countries are the most successful countries, and yet they're the most plagued by doubt. And it's almost like it's success guilt that we're suffering from. And we've got to get over this, and the sooner the better. You mentioned countries like Poland. I think the reason why it's different and better in places like Poland is because in very recent times, they've had existential struggles to deal with. I mean, the one Western country that still absolutely has a national project is Israel, because Israel is constantly subject to existential threat. For a couple of generations now, we in the main Anglosphere countries have not been subject to existential threat. We've had it very, very good. And this is, again, one of the paradoxes of these times.
Well, I think you're making the good times create weak men argument.
Materially, we've never been better off. But spiritually, we've rarely been worse off.
Okay. Well, I think that transitions somewhat to, I guess, what's just happening now with, war breaking out between Israel and Iran, potential war. So often we have exchanges of military assets and we don't declare it an actual war. Grossest example possibly being Vietnam, but what could certainly escalate into a more conventional war here.
Or we could have a special military operation.
A
war that's now lasted more than 3 years.
Yeah. I'm not even sure Iraq and Afghanistan were declared officially war. There was a war on terror in general. It was a war on an idea, but we don't declare war on states anymore for some reason. But so when I was speaking with folks who were helping set up the interview here, I said, well, here's the different areas I want to talk about. I said potential war between Israel and Iran. Well, that changed yesterday evening when, our time at least, when Israel launched what it says are preemptive strikes on Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities, research facilities, decapitated much of the general staff of the Iranian military complex. It's obviously got a response from Iran. Iran's not been particularly successful so far, but it's been less than 24 hours. I'd be pretty shocked if this does not escalate further. The question, I guess, is open. I'm pretty skeptical of any country that says it's launching a preemptive strike, and there is a role for preemptive strikes. The 7 days war that Israel launched, Israel launched a preemptive strike for the 7 days war. It very likely would have been either a loss or a near loss, like Yom Kippur, if they had not. But they provided evidence post facto that it was necessary, that its Arab neighbors were preparing to launch an attack, but they provided that evidence. But, we have the example of the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States and its allies that turned out to be, if we're being charitable, incomplete intelligence. If we're being less charitable, false intelligence. And they certainly toppled a
brutal dictatorship,
a murderous and
an evil regime.
Yeah, absolutely. But the Middle East is a different region here, where it's difficult to simply roll in. Here's McDonald's and car washes, cable TV, and democracy. It didn't take. That's an open argument. Would Iraq have just been better living under the brutal dictator? It's a difficult question to say, but regardless of who it was overthrowing, it was based. The casus belli of war was false, and I think it's incumbent upon Israel to provide some pretty solid evidence for this. The Iranian regime is arguably is significantly worse than the regime, the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. It's about as bad a regime as it gets. But I think is it not incumbent on Israel, though, to provide some real, tangible evidence that there was an imminent threat of Iran acquiring what they're saying between 10 to 15 nuclear devices?
My understanding is that unlike Iraq prior to 2003, there have been inspectors going into Iran in recent times, and they are reporting the physical evidence of centrifuges and others which are producing weapons-grade material. As far as I am aware, that is simply incontrovertible. It's as realistic as the evidence of the Holocaust, for instance, which some people will still deny. That's my understanding. And I think Israel has every right to take preemptive action against a regime which has been threatening for decades to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, which has been the sponsor of numerous acts of terrorism against Israel, and which has been hell-bent on getting a nuclear weapon for at least 2 or 3 decades. I think this is as justified a strike as any can be. Yes, let's expect Israel to produce appropriate evidence of exactly what it's done. Let's hope that the strikes succeed in their objective and then end. Let's hope that there are minimal civilian casualties, and let's hope against hope that the Iranian people might rise up against their oppressors and install a better regime. Let's dwell for a moment, though, on the Iraq War, which has cast a shadow across the contemporary psyche in the same way that the Vietnam War appeared to cast a shadow across the psyche of Americans growing up in the 1960s. I was part of the Howard government, which joined the Anglo-American assault on Iraq. We all thought that there were weapons of mass destruction. Even the opponents of the war thought there were weapons of mass destruction. Saddam kept telling us that he had weapons of mass destruction and he wanted to use them. We knew he'd used gas
on the Kurds,
on his own people, and I thought that was an eminently justified assault to topple the regime. I still think it was eminently justified. The Americans who were running the show made 2 cataclysmic and fundamental mistakes. They disbanded the Iraqi army, which meant there were 500,000 unemployed guys with guns. And they disbanded the Ba'athist civil service, which meant that no one knew how to run anything. And the country swiftly descended into anarchy. We had a plan for the war. We didn't have a plan for the peace. The Americans, and regrettably the British and Australian governments went along with this. The Americans had facilely assumed that windbags in exile, like that Shalabi guy, had far more support than they really had. And in retrospect, the best thing would have been to restore the Iraqi monarchy, because the only countries in the Middle East that work are the monarchies.
But would that not have been, that would have been very much in contradiction, though, to kind of the neoconservative push at the time of spreading democracy, that we're going to plant the seeds of democracy in the Middle East and it's going to flower, which is this chain reaction,
which is a nice ideal, but centuries of experience disproves it. I mean, democracy is a desirable further state of development, but you can't simply impose democracy.
It was like a heart transplant
on what is effectively a medieval society. I mean, as I said, the only countries that really work in the Middle East are the monarchies. Yeah. Democracy in the Middle East tends to be one man, one vote once, and it becomes a dictatorship, and it's usually a much worse dictatorship than the monarchical regimes, because the king wants his grandson to be in the same position that he's in one day. He's never going to completely alienate anyone. In practice, monarchies are negotiated societies rather than societies ruled by fear or force. And unfortunately, America is still neuralgic about monarchy because of the experience of George III.
Hard to imagine the American. I think you are right.
Experience of George III.
But that would have been weird to see the Americans do it.
But if they weren't prepared to come at a monarchy, which would have been the best outcome, they should have found the least bad of Saddam's generals and said, mate, you're in charge, and we will back you on two conditions. One, no genocide against your own people, and two, no terrorism against ours. But instead, yes, they tried.
We know the argument. It's the arson of the bitch. I think it actually.
They tried to impose a quasi-Western democracy. It's now got to, I think, a tolerably good position, but it's taken 2 decades, the best part of 2 decades, and in the process, there's been a ferocious civil war, which has cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, thousands of Western lives. It's spilled over into Syria, which is an ongoing issue. So look, you're right, but just because things have had bad consequences doesn't mean that they shouldn't have been done. And I don't think, even with the wisdom of hindsight, that overthrowing Saddam Hussein was a bad thing to do. It's just that there should have been much more realistic planning go into it.
I could see it. I could see it. I'm just not sure it was worth, the human and the cost and blood and treasure to get here. But I could see where you're coming from. But Iran is, I believe, 2 to 3 times the population of Iraq. It's roughly 90 million people off the top of my mind. Its military, I think, with reserves, is at 1 million. This is a substantially more powerful power to confront. Like Iraq, it's got a very divided population, less so ethnically. Iraq had the Sunni domination, domination of the majority Shiites. Iran is almost entirely Shiite. It has a few minorities, but not major components, the way Iraq has the Kurds. But it's divided between, a large minority of fairly liberal, westernized people who tend to leave in large numbers. And then the more theocratic, religious, fundamentalist side. There does not seem to be a way to outright march in and liberate it, Iraq style here, but short of an utterly cataclysmic war. And I know that's not what you're advocating. Yeah. My concern, though, is that if they were on the verge of a bomb, I think Israel was totally justified. that's the big question mark for me right now. If they were imminently on the verge of a bomb, well, then Israel really had no choice. They had to do what they did. If they were not, though, or Israel does not provide sufficiently convincing evidence of that, my concern is then that they have potentially just ignited a major regional war that could pull the Western powers in.
Well, that's all possible. And of course, Iran has always denied that its nuclear program was for military purposes, but it's always insisted that it did have a very active nuclear program, supposedly for peaceful purposes. And I don't think it's realistic to equate the Saddam situation in 2003 and weapons of mass destruction with the current Iranian situation.
Why not?
And well, because IEA inspectors have been in Iran and they've brought back reports of what they have seen with their own eyes. Now, as I said, the Iranians have always denied that this is for military purposes, but you do not need highly enriched uranium for anything other than military purposes. And it's as clear as anything can be that they were increasingly advancing towards highly enriched uranium. And look, all Israel wants to do, there are lots of things Israel would like. Israel would like a friendly regime in Tehran. Israel would like the kind of relationship with Tehran that it has with the Emirates, for instance. But all Israel is actually doing is trying to stop Iran's nuclear program from further progressing, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable objective. And let me also say this, Derek. There's been no condemnation of these Israeli strikes thus far from the Saudis, from the Emiratis, from the Jordanians, because
none of these guys like the Iranians. These guys are
they are all in fear, in existential fear of the apocalyptic ayatollahs of Tehran. And I tell you this, Derek, if Iran did get a nuclear weapon, within months, the Saudis would be buying one off the Pakistanis.
Yeah.
Turkey would be buying one off the Pakistanis. The whole global security arrangements and architecture would be radically deranged. So look, provided it's been successful and provided it doesn't substantially escalate, I think the Israelis have done us all a favor.
But those are two still big questions. Was it successful?
There are no certainties in this life.
Yeah.
But sometimes
it
just got to be brave.
And was it justified? Like, were they on the imminent threat of it? There have been reports that Iran is on the verge of a bomb for 30 years now. That doesn't mean they wouldn't actually eventually get there, but it means I want to see the proof.
I think you're like Thomas in the Gospels.
All right. Well, I certainly can be convinced. Well, let's maybe wrap it with a discussion of the G7. Fortuitous time that you're here. Friday right now on Sunday, just west of where we're sitting right now. We're in downtown Calgary, just west of us in Kananaskis, close to where I live. The leaders of the G7 are going to be meeting. Iran is obviously, I don't know how high on the agenda it was going to be before, but it's going to be probably pretty top now. Anything big? Every time Trump's at the table, it's so hard to predict anything that's going to take place. Even his biggest supporters will admit it's. I can't imagine who actually has to take care of planning this guy's agenda every day. It's kind of chaos. Particularly at this moment where Carney actually has him, I think, in large measure to thank for being in the prime minister's chair with his talk of 51st state, the trade war that took place. But at the same time, he's got to be really nervous about what Trump might do because, while there's a lot of similarities between Canada and Australia, I think one of the big differences is there's no major secessionist movements in Australia. I don't know where they would really want to go. But in addition to Quebec, it's now very, very real in Alberta here. We have a citizens initiative law that's been amended here, and it is near certainty we're going to be having a referendum on independence here in Alberta, potentially even Saskatchewan soon after, on independence. No one really in either Alberta or Saskatchewan talks about joining the United States. It's not really something most people are interested in. But Trump could look at this as a kind of power play for closer union with at least Alberta and Saskatchewan. I don't know. Do you know the man? And what opportunities for mischief do you see there, where he's going to literally be in Southern Alberta, kind of the heart of the movement of the independence movement in Alberta, at a time where he's been just dropping bombs on Canadian domestic politics?
Well, I think that there's two Trumps effectively. There's domestic Trump, who's largely positive force, and there's foreign Trump, who has often been a negative force. And most obviously, foreign Trump has been a negative force via his stream of insults against Canada, which I think were a key factor in the defeat of the Conservative Party here. Look, you're right. Any event involving President Trump invariably becomes the center of attention. He loves that. He loves keeping everyone off balance and uncertain as to his next move. I think, frankly, the best thing for anyone to do in responding to Trump is just keep calm and carry on. Keep calm and carry on. And I think that Trump's tariffs on Canada in the end are going to hurt America at least as much as they hurt Canada. And I think over time they're going to get rethought. I think the risk in America at the moment is a recession brought on by the uncertain investment climate and the price hikes that the tariffs inevitably will bring with them. And if Trump wants to secure his legacy, he's actually got to produce economic success, not economic chaos. And at the moment, it's been much more the latter than the former. So what's going to come out of the G7? Well, they will obviously talk a lot about Iran, and they will no doubt urge both sides to de-escalate, which is fair enough, as long as Israel's objective of preventing an Iranian bomb has succeeded. I hope that for the first time in years, the G7 might actually talk more about energy security and less about emissions. And if that happens, and we've got drill baby drill Trump coming together with a Carney who at least says he wants to see resource development. So let's hope that we get at least more common sense on energy out of this G7 than we have out of recent ones.
This final question. Have you seen the movie on the Emu War?
I haven't.
No?
No.
I haven't seen it yet either, but it's...
And the Emu War?
When your country fought a war against emus, birds, and lost. Australia's only lost one war, and it was against birds.
Now that you mention it,
they made a movie about it.
There was a campaign, I think, in Western Australia in the 1930s to eradicate emus. It was a
special military operation.
It was a misguided campaign. I think very few people were aware it was happening at the time, and they quickly worked out that it was a failure. I think the Emu Wars might ultimately be a bit of a piss take.
My favorite thing when I meet Australians, most Australians don't seem to know about it. If I bring this up, I make them take out their phone and Google Emu War, and there's a Wikipedia article, and it literally is structured like regular wars, like World War II has like the belligerents on one side with casualties listed. I mean, it was kind of like Vietnam. You beat the emus on the casualty count, but ultimately it was unsuccessful.
There we are. Well, that's one more I'm glad we lost.
All right. Tony Abbott, I've taken you way longer than was expected here, but I really appreciate your time. It's fascinating, and I hope you enjoy your time here in Alberta.
Thanks, Derek. Good on you. Thank you.
All right, that's Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, joining us for a wide-ranging talk. Thank you for your time. Remember to go to westernstandard.news, click on subscribe. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year to get unlimited access to all Western Standard content. Thank you for joining us today, and God bless.